It's exciting to be here. I realize I've never spoken at a YMCA before, so this will be a first. I will apologize that I'm a philosopher. Philosophers tend to read papers, so bear with me. I've got a PowerPoint. It's not very fancy or anything, but it's mainly quotes, so you can read the quotes while I'm reading them to you. So, I'll jump right in. Two MIT economists, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, opened their recent book, Poor Economics, A Radical Rethinking of the Way to Fight Global Poverty, as follows. Well, yeah, there we go. Every year, 9 million children die before their 5th birthday. A woman in sub-Saharan Africa has 1 in 30 chance of dying while giving birth. In the developed world, the chance is 1 in 5,600. There are at least 25 countries, most of them sub-Saharan Africa, where the average person is expected to live no more than 55 years. In India alone, more than 50 million school-going children cannot read a very simple text. Shocking data, but not surprising. We've all seen statistics like this before. What is surprising is what they say next. This is the kind of paragraph that might make you want to shut the book, and ideally forget about this whole business of world poverty. The problem is too big, too intractable. Our goal with the book is to persuade you not to. Actually, there are 2 surprises in this paragraph. The first is a shock of recognition. Yes, they're right. Such depressing statistics rarely motivate people to action. They may even be counterproductive. The second surprise is that peculiar last sentence, which I misread at first, as I suspect most readers do. It does not say the book is intended to convince you that the problem of poverty is not too big, not intractable. The sentence says the goal of the book is to keep you reading, and at least while reading, not forget about poverty. The authors succeed in meeting this goal. Poor Economics is a fascinating read full of concrete analyses based on actually talking to poor people, observing them closely, as to why specific anti-poverty policies sometimes succeed but more often fail. Why, for example, when poor people are given some extra money, do they not spend it on healthy food, but instead on luxuries? Why do many children die of diarrhea, even when chlorine bleach to purify their water and rehydration solutions are cheap and readily available? Why are so many rural teachers and healthcare workers desultory at work when they bother to show up at all? The authors also point to some successes, microlending, for example, although they readily admit we are kidding ourselves if we think this can pave the way for mass exit from poverty. Banerjee and Duflo conclude their study with these words. We have no lever guaranteed to eradicate poverty, but once we accept that, time is on our side. Poverty has been with us for many thousands of years. If we have to wait another 50 or 100 years for the end of poverty, so be it. At least we can stop pretending that there's some solution at hand and instead join hands with millions of well-intentioned people across the world, elected officials and bureaucrats, teachers and NGO workers, and academics and entrepreneurs, in the quest for many ideas, big and small, that will eventually take us to that world where no one has to live on 99 cents per day. What's wrong with this picture? The first thing we notice is that no attempt is made to motivate ordinary people to respond to what is surely an appalling situation. Theirs is a technocratic solution. They appeal to elected officials and bureaucrats, teachers and NGO workers, academics and entrepreneurs. The Banerjee-Duflo approach contrasts sharply with that of the poverty philosophers. Philosophers who began to look carefully at issues of global poverty from an ethical perspective. Consider Peter Singer, who broached this topic in a classic essay 40 years ago and who remains one of the preeminent voices in the field. In his seminal essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, he introduces a simple principle. If it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. He justifies this principle with a simple example. You're walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it. I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of a child would presumably be a very bad thing. Well, he argues, a child dying from malnutrition or from an easily preventable disease is as bad as a thing as a child drowning in a pond, and such a child could be saved if you wrote a small check to a relief organization with a good track record. So take out your checkbook, as he says. Discussion is not enough. What's the point of relating philosophy to public and personal affairs if we do not take our conclusions seriously? In this instance, taking our conclusions seriously means acting upon it. Another prominent philosopher, Yale University's Thomas Poga, is at least as insistent that ordinary citizens get involved. Are we hunger's willing executioners, he asks, an allusion to Daniel Goldhagen's best-selling book about the behavior of German citizens during the Holocaust, Hitler's Willing Executioners. Poga points out that we generally think, not without reason, that it's worse to kill someone than simply let that person die. Violating a negative duty is worse than failing to fulfill a positive duty. Well, he argues, the fact of the matter is we are killing poor people, not just letting them die. Policies put in place by our political leaders, our willingness to buy resources from corrupt, non-democratic leaders, our lending them money, repayment of which puts a crushing burden on the poor, are protecting our markets from poor country imports while subsidizing our own exports, are causing countless deaths. Such honorable and otherwise unremarkable people as our politicians and negotiators, says Poga, have knowingly committed some of the largest human rights violations the world has ever seen. He's an angry philosopher. In another article, he's even more scathing about our political leadership. Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin were vastly more evil than our political leaders, but in terms of killing and harming people, they never came anywhere near causing 18 million deaths per year. He goes on to argue, the fact that these crimes are committed by politicians and bureaucrats does not let the ordinary citizen off the hook. The fact that we choose to remain ignorant, choose to allow important structural features of the world economy to be shaped by unknown bureaucrats in secret negotiations cannot negate our responsibility for the harm that our governments inflict upon the innocent. That is to say, we citizens are responsible and so are duty-bound to take action. The failure of Banerjee and Duflo to appeal to ordinary citizens to get involved is one notable feature of their book. Another is the fact that they make no attempt to identify any large-scale macroeconomic causes of global poverty. This is not an oversight. They explicitly disavow such an attempt. They entitle a key section of their book, Against Political Economy. They see themselves as steering a course between big-picture economists like Jeffrey Sachs, director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, who see the poor as caught in a poverty trap, unable to be productive because they lack the funds for the initial investments that would allow them to be productive, thus concluding that a relatively small foreign aid push is all that is needed. And those like New York University's William Easterly, who thinks Sachs is completely wrong, for he claims foreign aid invariably makes matters worse for the poor. For Sachs, a bit more outside assistance would have a huge impact, whereas according to Easterly, governments should end their assistance programs and let the free markets work their magic. Banerjee and Duflo believe that attempts to explain poverty by looking at high-level institutions is a waste of time, since it's possible to have low-level anti-poverty policies succeed even when macro institutions are bad, and have them fail even when the macro institutions are good. But their refusal to look for higher-level causes calls into question their conclusion. If Banerjee and Duflo have no explanation as to the basic causes of global poverty, whence their optimism? Remember, they are convinced that if we stop trying to find macro causes, time is on our side, and that we will eventually, within 50 or 100 years, live in a world where no one has to live on less than 99 cents a day. It must be said their concrete analyses do make Sachs' easy optimism look as silly as Easterly's blind faith in free markets. Sachs has argued that if the rich would only commit $195 billion in foreign aid a year between 2005 and 2025, a relatively minuscule amount, Poverty could be entirely eliminated by the end of that period. It's worth noting, too, that Singer and Poga share Sachs's optimism, share his outlook. In 2006, Peter Singer, in a New York Times op-ed piece, looked at the Millennium Development Goals, which you may remember. These were goals adopted by all member states of the UN in 2000. Were, over a 15-year time period, accomplished the following: reduce by half the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. That's by 2015, like next year, right? Ensure that children everywhere can take full course of primary schooling. Reduce by 2/3 the under 5 infant mortality rate. Reduce by half the number of people without access to safe drinking water. Halt, then begin to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS, malaria, and other major diseases. He then looked at the cost estimates for meeting the goals as calculated by the UN's task force headed by Jeffrey Sachs. The commission came up with a figure of $121 billion in 2006, which is the year he wrote the piece, rising to $189 billion in 2015. He then did something interesting. He looked at the incomes of the top 1% of the US taxpayers, data only recently available. His conclusion is startling. If the top 0.01%, that is, the top 1/100th of 1%, contributed 1/3 of their annual income, leaving each household with $8 million to play with, and the rest of the top 1/10 of 1% contributed by 1/4, leaving with only an average of 1.5 million, we'd have $126 billion, $5 billion more than was needed in 2006. That is to say, without any additional contribution from any government, any U.S. citizen, any other U.S. citizen, or any U.S. citizen, the bottom 99.9% of the population, we could meet the Millennium Goals. So here's just what I was just, top 0.01% contributed 1/3 of their income, they'd have 8 million left. The next 0.1% contributed 1/4, leaving them $1.5 million. They'd meet the Millennium Goals without any additional contribution from anyone else in the world. Singer himself was startled by this. He says, for more than 30 years I've been reading, writing, and teaching about the ethical issues posed by the juxtaposition on our planet of great abundance and life-threatening poverty. Yet it was not until in preparing for this article I calculated how much America's top 1% actually make that I fully appreciated how easy it would be for the world's rich to eliminate or virtually eliminate global poverty. I find this results astonishing. Thomas Poga, for his part, says this: knowing the enormous magnitude of death and destruction caused by world poverty, one is inclined to assume that many things must go right for such a huge problem to be solved. But to the contrary, many things must go wrong for it to persist on such a massive scale. Despite its fearsome magnitude and destructiveness, the world poverty problem is fragile. What then, according to Singer and Poga, should be done? Well, Poga includes socioeconomic rights among his list of human rights. He endorses the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which specifies, among other things, the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being for oneself and one's family, including food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. He proceeds to argue that rich countries are violating the human rights of poor countries. Apart from policies that incentivize non-democratic seizure of power and corruption that eventually accompany companies non-accountable, Poga points his fingers to two sorts of activities which rich countries engage in that damage poor countries. The damage here is direct. Rich countries insist that trade barriers erected by poor countries to protect industries be eliminated while maintaining their own protectionist policies. Rich countries grant subsidies to many of their own producers while poor countries are compelled to scrap theirs. These policy asymmetries derive from the overwhelming power differential wielded by rich countries in trade negotiations. Poga proposes that such rich country tariffs and subsidies be removed. My complaint against the WTO, he says, is that they open markets not that they open markets too much, but that they open our markets too little. If these measures prove insufficient, he offers additional policy. He proposes that we institute a global resource dividend. He proposes that a tax be levied on all natural resources. The proceeds of this tax would then be distributed to the poorest of the poor. Boga notes that we need only raise about $300 billion, so this tax is hardly excessive. So just, summarizing what is to be done, Singer, write a check, many checks, and lobby our government to increase foreign aid. Boga and the resource in borrowing privileges for non-democratic governments, end our trade barriers and subsidies, and, if necessary, institute a global resource dividend. But here's the question. What if Banerjee and Duflo are right that the problem is not easy, for reasons they give and for deeper reasons, but wrong that time is on our side? What if there are deep structural reasons that neither they, nor Sachs, nor Easterly, nor Singer, nor Boga are willing to consider? What if Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen is right, who in his 1999 book, Development as Freedom, made this surprising assertion? The big challenges that capitalism now faces in the contemporary world include issues of inequality, especially that of grinding poverty in a world of unprecedented prosperity, and of public goods, that is, goods people share together, like the environment. The solution to these problems will almost certainly call for institutions that take us beyond the capitalist market economy. It is extraordinarily rare for a Nobel laureate in economics to say something like that. And Sen just says it and then goes on. But what if the structural causes of poverty are such things that will almost surely get worse, not better, unless they're addressed? So, part two, the deep causes of global poverty. I agree with Sen that the solution to the problems of grinding poverty in a world of unprecedented prosperity and of environmental degradation cannot be solved within the framework of a capitalist market economy. It should give pause to anyone who thinks that time is on our side in the struggle against global poverty, that poverty remains endemic even in the country that was the richest in the world when, 50 years ago, it declared an all-out war on poverty. President Lyndon Johnson, in his State of the Union address, January 8, 1964, 50 years ago, proclaimed a total commitment of this president, this Congress, and this nation to pursue victory over the most ancient of mankind's enemies. The results of the war? When President Johnson made his proclamation, the poverty rate was 17.3% in the United States. The poverty rate now is 15%, a half century later, 20% in 9 major cities, over 30% in Detroit. Now, no politician in the United States, nor anyone else whose opinion counts in this country, even pretends anymore that poverty can be eliminated. Progressive forces now battle to preserve what's left of our shredded safety net: food stamps, medical assistance, housing subsidies. It's now widely proclaimed that we can no longer afford such programs, despite the fact that we are, GDP per capita, twice as rich as we were a half a century ago. In truth, the connection between domestic poverty and capitalism is conceptually straightforward. A healthy capitalism requires unemployment, and unemployment must be unpleasant. But when the means of production are owned by one set of people and worked by another, a disciplinary stick is necessary to keep those at work from slackening their efforts or demanding ever higher wages. To be sure, there was a golden age of capitalism when new technologies were creating lots of new jobs, workers had the power to compel owners to share productivity increases, but those days are long gone. New technologies are not creating more jobs than they are destroying, and global competition has undercut the bargaining power of workers. As Bruce Springsteen sings in that painful saga, My Hometown, Foreman says these jobs are going, boys, and they ain't coming back. Now, one might object that this structural need for unemployment may explain the persistence of poverty in rich countries, but not global poverty. Indeed, global poverty would seem to be bad for capitalism. To be sure, the availability of cheap labor abroad can be and regularly is employed as a threat to keep the domestic workforce in line. But this benefit would seem to be outweighed by another, more pressing consideration, the need to sell one's products. Surely rich country capitalist firms would be better off if the rest of the world were richer and hence able to buy more than what they have to sell. Now we've come here to the heart of one of the capitalism's most fundamental contradictions. From the point of view of an individual capitalist, the best of all possible world would be one in which he could pay his workers very little, thus minimizing his costs, while other capitalists paid their workers a lot, thus maximizing the possible sales. But there's a collective action problem here. Our capitalist has some control over what he pays his own workers, but none over what other capitalists pay theirs. Oh.
Capitalist has some control over what he pays his own workers, but none over what the other capitalists pay theirs. Since all capitalists face the same situation, the general tendency is for wages to remain lower than what would be required to purchase all the goods that they can be produced. That is to say, there exists a general tendency for production.
And this overproduction is self-reinforcing. When too many goods are produced relative to effective demand, production is cut back, workers are laid off, demand is further reduced. The familiar downward recessionary spiral, which we're feeling here right now, they're feeling even worse, in Europe right now. We're now in a position to understand the basic arguments connecting contemporary capitalism to global unemployment. Let me sketch what I take to be the basic scenario being played out today. It's a four-part story. 1, capitalism is an enormously productive economic order. Each enterprise is under pressure to produce as efficiently as possible and to utilize the most productive technologies available. These productivity gains are employed to undercut competitors so as to enlarge market share, i.e. to produce and sell more. Hence, as Marx and Engels noted long ago, the ever-present threat of overproduction. Capitalist countries therefore always press other countries to lower their trade barriers. Moreover, since investors are concerned that their capital grow and since overproduction at home discourages investment at home, capitalists are eager for investments outlets abroad. Hence, capitalist countries press for the elimination of barriers to capital flow as well as trade. And when dealing with poor countries, rich capitalist countries usually get what they want. They have foreign aid at their own dispense, and they have effective control over the IMF and the World Bank, the major international agencies that grant aid and loans to poor countries. 3, but poor country agriculture and poor country industry cannot compete with rich country technology. So local agriculture is disrupted and local industries destroyed, rendering millions unemployed. This process is utterly current and as old as capitalism. Marx quotes from the Governor General's report of 1834-35 on the effects of British textile imports on India. Quoting the Inspector General, "The misery hardly finds parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." These displaced workers migrate to cities where they are available as cheap sources of labor for capitalist industries that are sometimes set up there, often financed by rich country capital. But to the extent that these low-wage workers, the relatively few who actually find work, displace high-wage workers in rich countries, the problem of effective demand and hence overproduction is further exacerbated. The result, severe poverty of half of mankind continues despite enormous economic and technological progress, with things likely to get worse, not better. Banerjee and Duflo are wrong. Time is not on our side. So just quick summary, wages are a cost of production, so they're minimized, lack of effective demand at home because there's not enough money to buy the products. Need for markets abroad, less developed agriculture and industry can't compete. Rural incomes drop, millions migrate to the cities, massive poor country poverty. Okay, part 3, an alternative. Our prognosis needn't be so gloomy, not if we're willing to consider, to quote Sen, institutions that take us beyond the capitalist market economy. In my books, Against Capitalism and After Capitalism, I present and defend one such set of institutions. I call the resulting economy economic democracy. Now, economic democracy is a form of market socialism that I've been long advocating. Competitive markets are retained, but democracy is extended to the workplace and to the financial sector. I don't have time to spell out all the details or elaborate the arguments. We can get into some of this in discussion if you want. But to give you a sense of what is possible, let me note that we could create a viable democratic alternative to capitalism in a country like the United States if we, first of all, democratize our publicly traded corporations, having management answerable not to shareholders but to the employees who elect a worker council, essentially a board of directors, and receive as remuneration for their work not a wage or salary, but a share, not necessarily equal, of the profits. So you have democratic control over management, and your income is a share of the profits. So the incentive to work hard and efficiently, is there. B, generate the bulk of society's investment funds not from private savings of wealthy individuals, but from a flat rate capital assets tax on all business enterprises. Then allocate these funds to regions on a per capita basis to be loaned out by public investment banks to existing businesses wanting to expand production or upgrade their technologies, or to entrepreneurial individuals or collectives wanting to start new businesses. Since investment funds are public funds, democratically determined priorities can be set for investment allocation, which is not the case under capitalism. That is to say, economic democracy replaces the two key functions of the capitalist class, monitoring corporate management and providing capital for investment, with more transparent democratic mechanisms. Notice, economic democracy remains a competitive market economy. It allows small businesses to exist as they do now. It even retains space for an entrepreneurial capitalist sector, those capitalists who are currently engaged in entrepreneurial activity. Again, we can discuss this more fully later if you're interested, but the capitalist that is simply getting income from ownership of means of production, that's what's now obsolete. In short, economic democracy keeps the competitive markets for goods and services, but democratizes labor and democratizes capital. And again, just to give you a kind of quick overview, the basic institutions of what I'm calling economic democracy: you keep the competitive markets, you democratize workplaces, so the employees elect a board of directors, a worker council, and they receive not a wage but a profit share. And you democratize finance. Investment funds are generated by a capital assets tax. You don't have to rely on the private wealth of investors. And you allocate these to regions on a per capita basis, so every part of the country gets each and every year as a matter of right, its share of investment funds to public banks, and they're loaned out to existing businesses and startup ventures. Now, a couple of other things. There is this entrepreneurial capitalist sector. Those capitalists that have a new idea, want to set up, that's fine. They can also get loans from the bank and proceed accordingly. When they decide to retire, then they sell the business to the state. The state turns it over to the workers. You've added to the democratic firms. And I don't talk about this here because it's not relevant to global poverty, but government is employer of last resort. I mean, one of the things that's absolutely central is that people have economic security, that if you can't get a job in the private sector or the public sector, the government will provide you a low-wage job doing something useful. And that can be done in a democratic economy because you don't have this disciplinary problem with the rest of your workforce. Okay. Again, we can talk about more of this later. There are two features of economic democracy that render it compatible with a world without poverty. It's also compatible with ecological sustainability, another problem insoluble under capitalism. But that's another story. First of all, democratic firms don't need to grow. I thought I had that. As they are under capitalism. They are not under pressure from shareholders to keep expanding value, for there are no shareholders. Indeed, successful firms grow only reluctantly, since taking on more employees means sharing the profits with more workers while diluting their democratic influence. In essence, democratic firms grow so long as there are increasing returns to scale, but stop when returns to scale are constant, whereas capitalist firms keep growing when returns to scale are constant, and only when decreasing returns set in do they stop growing, and that almost never happens in the real world. In essence, democratic firms behave like nonprofit institutions in a competitive market. Think of universities. Universities compete with one another for students. We certainly do at Loyola, particularly with our crosstown rival, DePaul. But it's generally a healthy competition. If DePaul introduces a new program or some other innovation that's attractive, we will likely follow suit. But we have no interest whatsoever in driving our competitor out of business or taking it over, any more than we in the philosophy department have any interest in doubling the size of our department or tripling the size. I mean, what would be the point? Now, since domestic firms don't have to grow, they are not under compulsion to penetrate poor country markets and drive out the less sophisticated local competitors. Overproduction is not a problem that it is with capitalism, since workers are free to cut back on production when demand falls off, giving themselves more leisure time in compensation. Indeed, using technological development to increase leisure rather than consumption is a key characteristic of this form of socialism, particularly since this choice favors environmental sustainability. The second feature of economic democracy that is key to eliminating global poverty is its aversion to wage competition. The firms in economic democracy continue to compete with one another for market share. It's a healthy competition, pressuring businesses to produce what consumers want, to innovate, to use their resources efficiently. But democratic firms have no interest in wage competition, since that clearly involves a race to the bottom. This aversion to wage competition also operates at the international relations. And after capitalism, I argue that a rich country economic democracy should adopt a policy of socialist protectionism. It should place a tariff on goods imported from low-wage countries so as to negate the cost advantage of low wages. That's the protectionist part. But it should rebate that tariff proceeds to the poor countries, to be used as the countries see fit in addressing their pressing problems. That's the socialist part. So there's an international solidarity, but you don't want wage competition. These proceeds need not go to governments in question. They might be more effective in channeling to NGOs, or working to improve conditions of workers there. Now consider some of the consequences. Since firms in economic democracy are protected from low-wage cost competition, the nation need not be protective of intellectual property, making such property freely available to poor countries. Workers need not worry that low-cost factories will be set up abroad utilizing these new technologies or producing these new products that will put them out of work. So we can give away our intellectual property. Indeed, given a much greater job security, you've got employer of last resort, among other things, the workers are much more likely to be generous than their capitalist country counterparts in responding to the needs of poor countries. They can devote more of their public research budgets to addressing poor country concerns, and can provide financial support for poor country students who wish to study in their research centers and institutions of higher learning. In short, citizens of an economic democracy can provide poor people with the tools they need to help themselves, respecting their autonomy, recognizing that it is they who must be the fundamental agents of change. It should be noted that health care and education should be high priorities for countries. Both are labor-intensive and, at least basic health care, with an emphasis on prevention, relatively inexpensive. And here, just a case that could serve as an example. I've been many times to Cuba, including last summer with Jean and Jermaine, and I've been looking at the data, and the data is quite striking. According to the World Bank's 2012 report, Cuba has a per capita income of 1/9 that of the United States. Life expectancy in Cuba is 79. It is 78 in the United States. The infant mortality rate in the United States is 50% higher than Cuba, 6.9 to 1,000 versus 4.5. Mississippi's rate is 3 times higher. The reason Cuba has nearly twice as many doctors per capita as does the United States, and they actually live in neighborhoods, huge emphasis on preventative care, and so on. Some more data. Education, which is universal and free. The UNDP Education Index places Cuba among the highest in the world. Environmental impact, this is an interesting one. Cuba is the only country in the world meeting the World Wildlife Fund's criteria for sustainable development, meaning it's ranked high in the UN Development Program Index of Human Development, but uses less than its sustainable per capita biocapacity. So, I mean, that example I think is important because it should make it crystal clear a sustainable world without grinding poverty is possible. Okay, last part, the motivation question. I've argued that if we're serious about living in a world without poverty, we must get beyond the capitalist market economy. No set of anti-poverty programs or policy, unless accompanied by fundamental structural change, will suffice. But such change will obviously require the efforts of millions. A move beyond capitalism cannot be accomplished by technocrats, however important competent technocrats might be in a viable economic democracy. But how might so many people become motivated to become involved? This motivation question, as we've seen, has been central to the poverty philosophers. Singer appeals to our sense of decency. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything comparable to moral importance, we ought to do it. Poga finds this motivation insufficient. The appeal of positive duties has been well presented by Peter Singer, Henry Shue, Peter Unger, and others, he says. If citizens in the affluent countries were minimally decent and humane, they would have responded to such appeals and would do their bit to eradicate poverty. If they did this, my argument, says Poga, would be much less interest. Poga, as noted earlier, argues that we are not only failing to aid the poor, we're causally implicated in keeping them poor. We are, in a real sense, hunger's willing executioners. Now, Poga sets out his argument more than a decade ago. Clearly, masses of citizens have not rallied to this appeal, any more than they have to Singer's. If anything, judging from my own experience in teaching both philosophers, fewer people have been moved to action by Poga, for Poga tries to make the reader feel guilty, and people do not like to feel that way. If there's no obvious, easy thing one can do to make things right, one turns away. There may be a better way to address the motivation problem. Instead of focusing on our moral obligations to the poor, perhaps we should think more about what poverty at home and abroad is doing to us, to those of us who are not poor. Consider this rather strange quotation from the young Marx. Our objects in relation to one another constitute the only intelligible language we use with one another. We would not understand a human language, and it would remain without effect. On the one hand, it would be felt and spoken as a plea, as begging, and as humiliation, and hence uttered with shame and with a feeling of supplication. On the other hand, it would be heard and rejected as effrontery or madness. We are so much mutually alienated from human nature that the direct language of this nature is an injury to human dignity for us, while the alienated language of objective values appears as justified, self-confident, and self-accepting human dignity. We would not understand a human language. What might that mean? Think of being approached by a beggar or a homeless person. Common occurrence where I come from, in Chicago. The person holds out a cup asking for money. The human impulse, when another human being asks for help, when he or she is expressing a need that one might meet, is to assist that person if one can. Think of Singer's little girl thrashing in a pond. The human impulse is to save that person. Or, near at hand, think of coming up with someone whose car is stuck in the snow and needs a little push to get it moving. We are social beings. We like to help each other. But that's not the way most of us respond to a beggar. We harden ourselves against that human impulse to help. We tell ourselves that the person should get a job, or that he or she will just use the money for drugs, or that giving that person $1 or $2 is pointless since it will no way solve that person's problems. Some of us become indignant, as Marx noted, at being put upon, arguing perhaps that there should be a law against begging in public places. The point I want to make is this. The existence of so many poor people clearly in need of help, people who have far, far less than we do, does something bad to all of us. We squelch that human instinct to help, harden ourselves, come up with a quick justification that often amounts to self-deception. Think for a moment. What do you say to your child or grandchild when in his or her company a beggar approaches? Wouldn't it be better to live in a world where we could speak and respond to a human language? But that means the world must change. That means we must change the world. Okay, but how will the necessary millions be motivated to struggle for social change? Well, critique is important, but not enough. It's important to be able to identify the deep structural causes that inflict so much damage on us, on all of us, poor and non-poor alike. It is also important to be able to describe an alternative set of institutions that would be economically viable and would not do such damage. Of course, it's not enough to sit back, criticize, and dream. Recall Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach. Philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So the next time a beggar approaches you, give him something if you can, and say a few words. You know this won't solve his problems, but let the gesture remind you that the world needs change and that you need to be involved some way or another in changing it. A hopeless project? Let me close with a short poem by the Irish poet Seamus Heaney, who died last year, which is quoted by Amartya Sen in his recent book, The Idea of Justice. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Thank you for your attention.
I misplaced the mic.
Well, I wanted to get something in real quick, and I hate to lose this time. So I think there's something fundamentally wrong in your frame of the diagnosis. We have this image that Africa is getting all this aid, lesser developed countries are getting all this aid. Actually, capital extraction by the financial economic system is greater than, by factors of, I don't know how much, of that aid. So making it all personalist, I think, is a problem. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that we are extracting more capital. A lot of it is the onerous debt that you did mention at the very beginning. So I wanted you to react to that, and I think it's an important part to put right up front, because shaking down donations at Davos of 30%, maybe that would give Sachs his money. But if we just stopped extracting the money out of and having these vulture funds do it, there would be a lot more options in Africa and lesser developed countries.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm certainly not going to disagree with that. I mean, I think, again, it's part of, the nature of global capitalism. But I think reforming any pressures you can put on these companies not to do that, yeah, I mean, that's the point. I mean, you want to change the world, you got to change it a piece at a time and get some of those things, up and in place, make people conscious of that. I absolutely agree with that. I'm not saying there's nothing to be done until you've completely changed the system. No, I mean, no, but we've got to be aware that you're going to have to change the economic structure of the world we're living in, or things are just going to get worse. They're going to get worse at the level of global poverty. They're going to get worse at the level of environmental degradation, and more people know that.
I was wondering if you could give me your thoughts on GMOs. It seems like there's a lot of people who think that that's the new solution or the next solution to poverty, including a previous Friday Forum speaker who is an economist. So if you could give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't have a sophisticated answer. I'm deeply suspicious of GMOs, and certainly, the dominance of, one or two Monsanto companies and suing people that, that are using their seeds and things like that is crazy. I mean, that's not crazy. It makes perfect economic sense. But this idea that there's going to be this technical fix, I mean, that's what they said about the Green Revolution, 30 years ago or whatever, that new technology was just going to eliminate hunger in the world. The problem isn't that there's not enough food. There's enough food to feed everybody. The problem is, how is it getting distributed? So just putting a lot more peasants out of work, so that you can have more food more grain per acre isn't going to solve the problem. There might be a role for some of that if you had a humane, policy that wasn't just oriented toward, maximizing resource extraction. That's not the world we're living in right now. So I'm deeply suspicious of the GMO as it's currently marketed.
My question is, in a condition of economic scarcity, what confidence can you have that democratically run economic institutions won't compete for wages? And I'd give the example of universities, at least in the United States, where recent PhDs face depressed wages because they're now competing over postdoctoral positions and teaching assistantships, or visiting teaching positions rather than tenure track positions, as they might have done in the past.
Well, I mean, the issue of universities is a bit different, I mean, that's a whole story, and it's the way university teaching has shifted from mostly tenure track faculty. I think the statistic was, 30 years ago, 2/3 of all the faculty were tenure track. Now it's 1/3, so that the new PhDs that are being churned out are being contract labor, part-time teaching, all of that. That's more complicated. I don't think it's not competitive pressure, in the sense that it's competitive in at least in one sense. I mean, one of the things that's happened as part of the university financial structure is universities have been building because you're trying to attract students, and you can attract students because loans have been readily available. So you've got to compete here, but the money isn't any problem for the students, except that now it is. It's becoming totally unmanageable. So I think the whole structure of university finance is also just a big crisis, waiting to happen. But generally, no. I think, and again, it's not the university faculty making the decision that we ought to have more part-time people than tenure track. That's not being made that way. There's been this corporatization of the universities and following the corporate model. No, I mean, I think democratically, workers don't like to compete on the basis of cost. We don't want to pay ourselves less, make less. So, so there's a general sense, and again, the empirical evidence on cooperatives, they don't compete costs by lowering their prices to try to drive the other person out of business and so on. There's much more of a sense that you compete for market, it's kind of defensive. You don't want to lose market share, okay? So you want to keep up with whatever good ideas the other places are doing. But, you don't want to drive them out of business, so you can raise your prices and, that kind of thing. So it's a much more stable environment. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you don't see even successful cooperatives expanding all over the place, because there's a lot of empirical evidence that democratically run firms are at least as efficient, often more efficient than comparable capitalist firms. Well, then why aren't they all over the place? Because successful capitalist firms expand. Democratic firms don't, So, I mean, that can be a really good thing when we're talking about, having an economic system that fits with the sustainable, environment.
Hey, over here. So your analysis kind of privileged government at the regional level as being the most effective way to reallocate taxes. I wonder if you could expand on that and maybe put that in contrast to municipalities and states and kind of our current status quo.
Well, actually, the model of economic democracy does privilege regions. See, the idea here is, at least at the level of finance, okay? Finance is generated, by a capital assets tax on capital. So it all comes to the center. It's a flat rate tax. But then it goes back to regions, okay, on a per capita basis. So back to states, let's say, you get your per capita share. And then from the states, it goes to communities on a per capita basis. So the idea here is you want your investments to go where people are. You don't want a situation, which we have, where people have to go. Certain regions of the country are deindustrializing, so people have to leave and they have to migrate to where the jobs are being created. It makes much more sense to say the capital ought to come to where the people are. People ought to set up businesses there. So the idea of having a more emphasis on local, regional, not total self-sufficiency or anything, but moving in that direction, I think this is a structure that sort of lends itself to that. And it's certainly what I think, a sustainable world is going to have to look like.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about some of the problems in implementing what you're talking about. And there, the state becomes very important. For example, there is a national cooperative bank in Hillsborough, Ohio. Most of their loans are made in the state of Ohio or New York because the legislation in that state, it facilitates much more the creation of cooperatives. We have a national bank, I believe, a state bank in North Dakota.
Right.
But that's not the predominant form. So I think that what we're going to have to do is not only indicate that there are certain models, but the impediments, the political, structured impediments that legislatures and politicians could do something about if they recognize the value of these kind of non-killer shark enterprises which emphasize cooperation rather than cooperation and growth just for the sake of growth.
No, I think that's a really important question, an important point, because the issue of how to make it, see, my sense is you need to have a sense of where it is you want to go, and so knowing that what we want are democratic enterprises, we want democratized finance and so on, then what steps can you move in that direction? What kind of reforms? And certainly, there's much more attention now being given to cooperatives, than has been, in recent memory, actually. I mean, the UN actually declared, I think it was 2012, the year of the cooperative, because the cooperatives have turned out to be much more resilient than most other kinds of firms during the financial crisis. So getting some of that on the ground, some state support for that, some research, technical support, institutes like that, and those are springing up. I mean, you've got a lot of things going on in Cleveland right now, the Cleveland Clinic, a lot of attention being paid to the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain. In fact, there's a high school in Chicago that's in one of the poorest sections of Chicago. A very innovative approach to education, to high school kids they've linked up with small businesses, sophisticated technical businesses to give them on-the-job training. But a number of the students, in fact, went to Mondragon, Spain to observe, what is possible there. Likewise with public financing, State Bank of North Dakota. More and more states are interested in that because the State Bank of North Dakota didn't collapse during the collapse, and in fact, has done quite well. And so the idea of locally certain things are possible that aren't possible on the national level yet. I mean, clearly, one of the slogans, of what I like to talk about, you got to democratize work, you got to democratize capital, you got to democratize democracy, because we don't have that. Almost everybody knows that now. I was just really struck. I was teaching in my undergraduate class, teaching Plato, right? And I had Plato's got these different kinds of governments, military government, but oligarchy, democracy, and so on. I had my class, freshmen, break into little groups. What kind of government do we have? Out of a class of 35, only 3 said democracy. The other 32 said oligarchy. It's just, there's got to be something done about democratizing democracy as well, and again, there are reform proposals, out there. And some regions, are more amenable to change than others, and so, let's focus on the places that you can get something done, There's a lot of things that need to be done, but what we know for sure is the status quo is not sustainable. It is not going to be this. That's what I tell my students. You're living at a historical juncture here. There's no going back. The future is either going to be a lot worse and a lot more miserable, or a lot better. It's going to depend on what we do. Who's got the microphone? Oh, there we go.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And the discussion about economic democracy. The last portion you talked about motivation, and as part of that, I'm understanding also education, and I'm also understanding public discourse. And so this public discourse is just so precious, so important to me. And I would love to know your views on the role of media, of all different forms of media. I mean, when we think of the major media houses that control the majority of foreign media, for example, that's three companies in the world. And yet, we listen to one music before, and so I'm just, but all these different media ways of communicating with each other, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's really, again, we're in this period where it's hard to know because there's this massive consolidation, but also there's individuals with computers have access to all kinds of information that we didn't have before. Yeah, so for example, last night I had an extra credit film showing of The House I Live In. I don't know if you've seen that. Extraordinary documentary on the war on drugs. And it's free online. You could just set it up in a theater, in your classroom and show something like that. So the importance of those kinds of things, I think, where, you see people, it's more than just reading about it, when you're actually seeing people talking and what they're living, how they're living, and so on. So it's hard to know. There's the ability of mobilizing, maybe, but there's also, everyone's split off, and there's a lack of common purpose and so on. We don't know how this is going to turn out, and it's going to turn out. Part of the way it's going to turn out is what we do. Yeah, no, that's a really important question. And I don't have, it's not like there's this, I can point you, work with this organ. The fact is, and it is interesting, the ecologist Paul Hawken wrote a book, I think 2006, that I like to quote the title of. Blessed Unrest is the title, and the subtitle was, How the Largest Social Movement in Human History Has Come into Being and No One Saw It Coming. And he talks about going around, since he's a famous environmentalist, speaking all over the country, all over the world. And every place he goes, he finds there are these groups that he didn't know about, So he starts doing research. How many groups are there out there now involved with environment, with social justice, indigenous rights? And he came up with something like 2 million, a database. There are a lot of things going on beneath the surface. And here my sense is, no one can do everything, but you can do something. And so that's also what I think is really important. And it hasn't yet happened, but I think it could happen. The sense that you can be doing lots of different things, involved in lots of different groups, but you're part of a common project. The sense of, I call it in my book, the counter project. And part of what led me to think about this is the astonishing fact that, in the middle of the 20th century, there wasn't a country in the world that didn't have a communist party, right? So often illegal, sometimes very small, but the sense of people all over the world that you're part of something larger than yourself that is struggling, to change the world. And that's very powerful. I mean, it's very powerful if you can feel like you're doing things, yeah, what you're doing, yeah, that's not, but you're part of something that's bigger than that, you know. So pick the one that seems best, because there are plenty out there. Once you start looking, you know, you're going to find that there are, you know, lots of groups out there that are worrying about environmental issues, worrying about the pipelines, you're worrying about poverty, hunger, you know. I'm working with a group trying to get people's power turned, they're shutting off gas, you know, heating in Chicago in the middle of winter. People are getting their gas turned off. How do you get that back? I mean, those are little things, but it's part of like giving something when someone approaches you. If you're doing something, it reminds you that this is part of a much larger thing, but you got to be doing something. That's to keep your sanity, I think, you know.
It sounds to me very much like what you're recommending is something along the lines of Sweden the Mill Way, which was very popular when I was a student. There have been many critiques down through history of the harsh edges of capitalism. And I think that there needs to be kind of a model when it's went to. I'm sure you don't want to point to, say, North Korea,
Right.
Stalinist Russia.
Right, right.
But I'm wondering if Sweden the Middle Way isn't something that you talk about democratization within firms and so forth. And I'm wondering if it isn't something that is close to what you're recommending.
Well, Sweden is an interesting example. Now, I've been given a number of talks there, and my first reaction is, why are you asking? What you have looks like paradise compared to where I come from. You know, students don't have to pay for tuition, you know, and so on and so forth. But the Swedes they do feel that, no, their model is very much under attack right now. Globalization is taking its toll. And also, Sweden came very close to having a peaceful transition to a genuinely socialist society. There's still a capitalist class that owns most of the property and the wealth. I mean, it's not as unequal as we are as here by any means, but we had the Meidner plan back in, I believe it was the late 70s, when the chief economist for the ILO, it's the National Federation of Unions, had this proposal where each year 10% of a company's profits, equivalent to that, would be issued in shares of stock in the company that would be overseen by the ILO, and each year you'd get 10% more, and so after 15, 20 years, the workers would own the means of production. You know, I mean, it was, and of course, the capitalist class at that point freaked out in Sweden. The Swedish Social Democratic Party, which had ruled uninterrupted since the 30s, lost the election, and that was sort of taken off the agenda. But Sweden, I mean, there are a lot of countries there that can do even more than they're doing, and they do feel besieged, but there might be, that's the other sense. If something breaks somewhere, something qualitatively new makes an appearance, that will serve as a model, you know, for other places. That's why you're watching Iceland right now. It's again, when you're part of this sense that, you know, it's a global project out there, you're looking for success stories. I mean, you look at Mondragon, and the cooperatives there have survived and are flourishing, and you've got 80,000 people, you know, involved in cooperatives. Or, you know, Iceland defaults, and, you know, they're seem to be getting back on their feet. I mean, what's going on? Because clearly the existing structures don't work, you know.